So Vladimir Putin has written an essay and published it in a Western think tank, one that I actually have a strong affinity for. So let's go through it. Hello everyone, welcome to Dangerous Policy. My name is Crispin. Right now we are constantly updating the format all of the time. We are now going to do 6 segments where I kind of talk directly to you guys, the audience. And then on the 7th, Charlene and I will do a sort of an hour-long podcast where she will review the previous week's work and we will have a direct discussion about those things based on the questions that she would like to ask. At the moment, I feel like we are doing these podcasts where she acts more as a prompt rather than a proper interviewer, and it's sort of like I'm talking to you guys at home, but also to her, and it's I don't think it's really fair for her because she's not really giving the right amount of input. So this will hopefully change things up, be both good for you guys, the audience, and also for us here at the podcast. We'll see how it goes, and we'll constantly improve. So today I want to talk about something that has got relatively little attention, and that is that Vladimir Putin himself wrote a quite a long essay and published it in the National Interest. The National Interest is a major foreign policy think tank in the United States. It's quite possibly my favorite think tank in the world. I've written for it many times before, and it's run by these extraordinarily genial folks. So my friend Harry Kazianis is the editor there, an influential voice in the US, and I think does a great job. And then Jacob Hellebrun, I think, is the director of the Center for National Interest, the sort of parent think tank that sort of publishes the National Interest. And it's a sort of a realist foreign policy think tank that sort of takes American exceptionalism out of the picture and just looks at the world as it is. So in that context, it doesn't surprise me a hell of a lot that Vladimir Putin would write an article for them, but still quite an interesting choice. And the other thing I like about the National Interest is that they tend to be on the cutting edge of things. Donald Trump in 2016, when he was running for office, his major foreign policy address was made to the National Interest in June, well before he was elected. So they tend to kind of be, able to see where the wind is blowing, let's say. So in that spirit, I read the entire essay that Mr. Putin wrote, and I'll put my cards on the table now. I don't hate Vladimir Putin. I think in the context of the Russian system, and this is the sort of context people need to think about, we in the West could do a lot worse than Vladimir Putin. There are parties in the Duma that have as their policy platform to nuke Chechnya, right? Like seriously out there stuff. And yet Mr. Putin, I think, is quite a moderate figure in that. There are things that I think he definitely needs to improve on. But by and large, we could do a lot worse. And in that spirit, he's written an extensive essay, which I have in front of me now. And I will leave a link in the description below. I would really encourage you to go and read it for yourself. But it's written in the 75th anniversary of the end of the Great Patriotic War, where the Soviet Union captured Berlin and ended the Third Reich. It's a really quite a serious essay, and much of it I think he wrote himself. The first few paragraphs and the last few paragraphs, definitely. And then there's little anecdotes scattered throughout, which means he's definitely injected a certain flavor into it, even if a lot of it's written by a number of fairly patriotic historians. But the crux of it is that he's upset that that the EU seems to be rewriting history in his mind. That they're putting a lot of the blame of the war onto the shoulders of the Soviet Union itself, and basically saying that because Hitler and Stalin had the Non-agression pact, the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, that basically started the war. They agreed to carve up Poland and the rest is history. And Vladimir puts in a spirited defense of the Soviet Union and Russia during this time. And I sympathize with a lot of what he has to say, to be honest. Not everything, right? And we will definitely go into that as we progress. But before I go on, I just want to read out a couple of paragraphs from the essay. I definitely don't want to steal the thunder of the national interest. And again, do go and check it out. Maybe we can have some of it on the screen. We'll see. But just in the opening bits, he says, they usually, quote, "They usually say that the war has left a deep imprint on every family's history. Behind these words, there are fates of millions of people, their sufferings and the pain of loss. Behind these words, there is also the pride, the truth, and the memory. For my parents, the war meant the terrible ordeals of the siege of Leningrad, where my 2-year-old brother, Vitya, died. It was the place where my mother miraculously managed to survive. My father, despite being exempt from active duty, volunteered to defend his hometown. He made the same decision as millions of Soviet citizens. He fought at the Nevsky Pietrok, I hope I pronounced that right, probably not, Nevsky, I understand, bridgehead, and was severely wounded. And the more years pass, the more I feel the need to talk to my parents and learn more about the war period of their lives. However, I no longer have the opportunity to do so. This is the reason why I treasure in my heart those conversations I had with my father and mother on this subject, as well as the little emotion they showed. People of my age, and I believe it is important that our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren understand the torment and hardships their ancestors had to endure. They need to understand how their ancestors managed to persevere and win. Where did their sheer, unbending willpower that amazed and fascinated the whole world come from? Surely they were defending their home, their children, loved ones, and families. However, what they shared was the love of their homeland, their motherland. Their deep-seated, intimate feeling is fully reflected in the very essence of our nation and became one of the decisive factors in this heroic, sacrificial fight against the Nazis. And so you can see there is a sort of pathos to this writing. And the fundamental crux of it is that he sees, now that the people are passing into memory, that all we have is not just the first-hand accounts of the war, but we have to now kind of study it as a matter of history. And he resents bitterly the way he sees the EU pushing a lot of the blame onto the Soviet Union, something that they could never have done while the veterans were alive, who remembered what happened. And to that spirit, I do think we need to remember that the war was won by the Soviets. There were 27 million deaths in Russia and the Soviet Union throughout the war. That is greater than all the other casualties of all sides in every form of theatre during that conflict combined. That includes the bombings of Japan, the struggles on the Western Front, the occupation of France. Like, all of this didn't compare to the total number of sacrifices that the Soviets had to endure. And we need to remember that always. So even if we have disagreements about politics and interest and worldview, the rest of humanity owes a debt of gratitude to the descendants of the Rus, and we shouldn't forget that. And even if we can never repay that debt, but the least we can do is remember it. So I think that the spirit behind this essay requires a lot more attention, because I think Vlad isn't just giving his own opinion on stuff. He's actually representing quite deeply, I think, the spirit and feeling of the Russian people, and I think we should take this seriously. However, there is actually also a historical narrative he's pushing here, and there are some things that I definitely agree with, and there are some things that I disagree with. And I think we should talk about this fairly and have that debate. And I think one of the reasons he would publish in the National Interest is because most of the readers of this publication are kind of open to debate. They're not necessarily pushing a strong ideological viewpoint. So the things that I agree with in his long essay, Well, first of all, he says, look, there's a lot of blame to go around for the rise of Nazi Germany and World War II. This, you can't just push it onto the Soviet Union. And he's absolutely right about that. He makes a very strong case as to how appeasement and isolationism contributed to Hitler's rise. And we can't forget that. I mean, the absolute sailing down the river of Czechoslovakia, the secret deals that were made at Munich that kind of gave Hitler the confidence to rebuild his military and expand without interference from Britain and France. Like, you know, appeasement is a policy that is attributable to Britain. Isolationism was a policy attributed to the United States. So you can't just sort of say, well, this all happened because of the Soviet Union. And what Vlad says is, look, in the 1930s, we were already fighting the Japanese in Siberia, Gulf and Gol. Why wouldn't we, when we can see the Western powers selling Eastern Europe under the bus, right? That we would not want to have a non-aggression pact with Germany. You know, obviously our national security was at grave risk. And he makes the case that the Soviets ultimately gave Germany a lot less than what they were asking for. And that's a matter of historical record. Like the Germans had much greater aspirations for their non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. They wanted the Soviet Union to contribute much more towards more of a quasi-alliance than the Soviets were ever willing to give Germany. So that's a fair point. And then he goes on to make the case that when Hitler invaded Poland, the Soviet Union delayed their invasion of Poland as well, and then restricted themselves not to what was even agreed in the pact, but those things that were core to their national security. They saw, Vlad's argument is that the Wehrmacht goes into Poland, Britain and France declare war on Germany, but they don't really do anything to help the Poles. They go through that sort of period of the phony war, and therefore, when it was clear that Poles were doomed, the Soviet Union felt that it had to invade East Poland and take control of territory that was necessary for its national security. So I have to say I disagree with this, and I'm sorry, Vlad, but I think this is a bit self-serving. It is the case that that the Soviet Union did not capture all of the territory that was potentially agreed to be carved up between Germany and the Soviet Union. But I think it's more a product of the Soviets being surprised by the fact that the Wehrmacht had done so well to defeat Poland, and also surprised by the fact that Britain and France were not able to do anything about it. Even a certain degree of surprise that they declared war in the first place, that they were uncertain about how to proceed. So it was more like getting the going while it was good, rather than because there was a circumspect perspective that the Soviets would not actually do what they had agreed that they might do. So yeah, I think that's a bit self-serving. The other thing that Vlad says is that the occupation of the Baltic states was legal in the context of the time, and that was such a lackluster bit of this essay. Clearly it was wrong. You know it was wrong, Vlad. I know it was wrong. The Baltic states know it was wrong. The whole world knows it was wrong. So it's probably not a good thing to defend. That was that annexation of the Baltic states was totally illegitimate and clearly a matter of historical record. The other thing that he says is that the Soviet Union liberated Eastern Europe when marching back towards Germany. And their definition of liberation and my definition of liberation is probably quite different, because when I think of liberation, I think that the people who were supposedly liberated should at least agree with that proposition. However, they feel like they've been occupied for 50 years, and there's plenty of horrific cases of Soviet occupation that supports that. So I don't, and so I think to use these sort of terms is not right. But Vlad, to his credit, does say, and probably uniquely in a way, that look, he's not defending everything that the Soviet Union did. There is things that he disagrees with, and he calls some of that out. And he also seems to have a strong admiration for Winston Churchill, even though Winston hated the Soviet Union, and he speaks to that quite a bit. He does introduce these snippets throughout where he quotes Churchill, and I think he sees things as a bit of from his point of view. But he does say, for example, and this is probably the biggest concession in his essay, that the Soviet Union never contemplated joining the Allies at any stage until they themselves were invaded. And I think that's his biggest regret. He says, look, while the Soviet Union didn't do anything to encourage Hitler in his mind, when Britain was standing alone against Hitler in 41, when France had fallen, there was no point at which the Soviet Union was like, yes, we have to join in and stop the fascists. And I think Putin calls this out. He says, look, that was a big mistake. It was self-serving and it was wrong. And they paid the price for that mistake. The Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union and cost them dearly. So I think that's a good thing to say, that it acknowledges the role that Britain played to the moral courage to continue the fight, even when the Soviet Union did not look like they were going to help. So that's a good thing. And and there's a lot of depth of detail in this essay. So what I think has happened is he wrote kind of the introduction and the conclusions, and then within his bureaucracy, they sent up a whole lot of information, and he probably made some tweaks here and there and interjected the sort of the Churchill stuff, and then approved it for publication. So I guess to summarize, go read it. Most people who have been reading it have been kind of looking at the tea leaves of what it means for today. How is the Chinese treated in this essay, and what's his worldview? If I was to give an answer to that question, and I think he is focusing more on the memory of the war and how important this is for the Russian soul. But if I was to give a contemporary political analysis, it would be that he's stung by the EU. That from his perspective, Russia is still a European country. It's part of the European community, and whatever differences they have, it's not right to write out the memory of those people who saved the world. I mean, 80% of the German war machine was destroyed by the Soviet Union. I mean, it's the Soviets who won the war. All the great battles were Soviet victories. So Stalingrad, Leningrad, Berlin, Kursk, like all of these, they were the changing moments. They paid the price. There's a wonderful data graphic that you should all go and look up. I'll leave a link in the description. It won all these prizes for visual statistics. And it was World War II casualties, and you look at what the Soviets suffered versus the rest of the world. I mean, when we talk, if the West knew even half about the Eastern Front as they know about, say, D-Day, we would have a very different attitude towards the Russian people, I think. Like, so, for example, there's 2,500 Americans died at an Omaha beach, a significant battle and a significant loss of life. 2,500 in a single day is not cookies, right? But if you compare that to the Soviet Union, they had 11,000 Omaha beaches, right? Like, you just can't comprehend. At a time when the world population is, probably a third of what it is today, they lost 27 million people. All the people who came back from the war who were maimed and destroyed. It has shaped the Russian view of an already hardy people, contributed to their understanding of the world, their experience of life, their hardship, their the depression in spirit. Like to rewrite history, to say that it's their fault that the war started, is cruel, and is applying a modern dig at a historical reality. So whatever else we might say about Russia, about what Russia's doing in different parts of the world, the threat that it poses, we should never forget that sacrifice. I think that this is something that we should all cherish and value. And as an Australian, we have issues. MH17. Tens of dozens of Australians were killed when that plane was downed, and no one has been held accountable. There are things that we have that are problems with Russia, but I will never forget that sacrifice, and I never get tired of reading and learning about the Eastern Front and from the stories, everything from Zhukov right down to the average common soldier. They all have stories to tell that we should all cherish and remember. So Vladimir was right to write this essay, and I agree with its spirit, if not all of its detail. Certainly I have a strong affection for the Baltic states and the way that they've kind of, what he's written here is something you say when you have nothing to say. Like it was definitely not a defense that can hold water, but on this anniversary of the Barbarossa invasion, which is kind of when he wrote it, I think it's a good argument to make, and cheers to Putin.